That's right. This video wasn't made for you. Especially you, Steven. I'm making this for a friend of mine, Andy. Hi, Andy. And I'm making it to show him that a painter at any skill can get quality results like this. Now, being a novice painter, I understand that you don't have a ton of hobby space or hobby supplies, and I'm going to be taking that into consideration in this video. We're not going to be using a ton of different brushes. Really, just a starter set with one or two more thrown in there. I tried to limit the paints too, so we're not pulling from a excessive library of acrylics. Instead, trying to keep it to paints that you would probably already own, or very few if you have to go out and buy them. And lastly, none of the techniques here are really that advanced. Everything is extremely beginner friendly and are meant to help you exercise your brush control to improve going forward. We're going to start by cleaning up any areas on the model that look like this, using our handy dandy Exacto Knife and sanding stick. With the Exacto, you'll scrape across any of the mold lines gently and remove them. Also, any of those bits from where it got clipped from the sprue, you'll want to remove any excess tabs there. Then come in with our sanding stick and just even out the area. Now, with our models all cleaned up, we're surely ready to put them together. Right? Yes, but don't. Take a second to consider what you're painting. Here, on the topic, let's look at the Horus Heresy Legions. On this instance, we're painting Night Lords, all in their midnight clad. So we can go ahead and assemble the entire model, as it's one universal color. But let's say, for example, we wanted to paint my favorite Legion, the Salamanders. Or for some reason, you wanted to paint Sons of Horus. In those instances, they have a couple of distinct parts that are completely different from the primary color. So, keeping speed in mind, it would be easier to keep them in the sub-assembly to prime and paint them in their base coat. Now, while assembling these models, you're going to need something to stick them together. Typically, you're going to be using either a plastic cement or super glue. Plastic cement is typically what I use while assembling miniatures because it actually melts the pieces together to form a really strong bond on these pieces. Super glue has the benefit of being very easy to access, sets up fairly quickly, and there's accelerants to make it even faster, but comes with the downside of that it doesn't really bond the pieces together, and it creates potential breaking points in the future. There's also the, I suppose, somewhat specialty mix of sprue goo, which is basically just plastic cement with a bit of the plastic melted into it to make a thicker concoction. I'll use this when I need to bond larger pieces or I have big gaps I have to fill. And to spice these up, we're going to be using the Night Lords upgrade kits from Forge World. These are really cool bits with excellent casting. So good you can actually see the 3D printed layer lines. Now, resin requires its own special setup to work with. One, you're going to want to wash it to remove any mold release from it so your paint will actually adhere to it. Two, you have to use super glue if you want to attach it to the model. Plastic glue will not work. And three, you should probably wear any kind of mask while sanding it, as resin dust is extremely harmful. Now I'm going to be putting a really simple ruined city base onto these guys. To do it, I'm going to start off by breaking up a bit of this cork coaster. Then I'll be gluing on a homemade basing mix I've made from construction sand and a bunch of stuff I found at the dollar store. Now there's a lot of really cool basing materials out there, so feel free to use literally any of them, be it simple texture paint or even some of the Geek Gaming Scenics base ready. Keep in mind that if you plan on using the texture paints or base ready mix, that you will do so after painting. Having to paint your base ready kind of defeats the purpose of them being base ready. Okay, now that the models are assembled and based, we can move on to priming. Priming is an important part of painting because they give you a clear base coat to work from, on top of helping the paint adhere to the model. Now, primers come in a ton of shapes and sizes and price ranges. I'm going to recommend you stick with rattle can primers for now, as they come in a variety of colors, and most are pretty affordable, especially if you're shopping in a hardware store. Be careful not to overdo it, because it's really hard to fix a model that's just absolutely blasted by a spray can. You can also buy brush-on primers. I'm not the biggest fan of these. You have to play with the paint to keep it the right consistency, and they just take forever to apply. But I understand their benefit if you really don't have anywhere to spray. Lastly, and my personal favorite, is airbrush priming. An airbrush is a big investment for the hobby, and it requires its own space, so it's not for everyone. But for the ability to use any paint I want, on top of controlling the pressure and amount that I spray through it, it is a mainstay in my hobby arsenal. In this instance, I'm going to use my airbrush using my favorite primer, Monument Hobbies ProAcryl Black-Brown Primer. And this will definitely not prove to be a mistake later. Alrighty, Andy. First big step, applying paint to the model. But before that, something that be commonly overlooked by beginners is paint consistency. And that's how this happens. Not a problem though. It's an easy thing to get right. We're just going to use our thumb. It's easy to see if it's too thick or too thin this way. Here's a quick little diagnostic to see where your paints lie. Now to apply our base coat, brush selection is key. Here. Perfect. That's right, a sponge. No, not this one. We're going to use some packaging sponge, like this. Keep in mind, while sponging the model, that you're going to be gently tapping the paint on. Don't squeeze it out and glob the paint on. This is strictly a no globbing zone. Sponging is an awesome technique for beginners because it requires next to no skill and be used to create some really cool effects. If it's interesting textures on armor, weathering effects, or chipping. But it didn't really show up strong enough here, so we're just gonna brush on the base coat. Now that's a clean looking base coat, right? Unfortunately, after hand painting all of this armor dark blue, I realized I could have saved a ton of time by just spraying it down with the dark blue rattle can. Highlighting doesn't have to be an intimidating process, especially since we're going to be dry brushing. Dry brushing is a technique full of oxymorons. However, it's an easily acquired skill that has a high ceiling. It's a 3-step process. Apply paint to brush, remove paint from brush, and apply paint to model. While working the paint off the brush, you don't want to use something like a paper towel or cardboard. Really, anything that would absorb moisture is bad. This is because the more moisture you remove from your paints, the chalkier the paint becomes applied. Personally, I use a cork coaster for my texture palette. You're really just going to be targeting the edges with this dry brush. You can kind of see that I went a little too heavy, as with some of the armor panels are turning into that bright blue as well. If you want to take a deep dive into dry brushing, I can't recommend enough to go over to the Artist Opus YouTube channel, where they get outstanding results. Now let's dive into the brushwork. After all, this wouldn't be a real Night Lords tutorial without a little bit of lightning. To keep it simple, we're just going to use the same light blue paint we just dry brushed on. Lightning doesn't have to be hard. In fact, it's actually really easy to do. Pick a point on the edge of the armor panel to start the bolt. From there, just paint a jagged line across the panel and come back to add some branches to it. It's okay to make this line a bit thicker. In fact, encouraged, because later you're going to be coming back to it and tracing inside of it. Moving on to the red details, this is where we're going to start working on your brush control. You're going to paint the bat wings on the shoulders, any of the cables on these new Heresy Marines and the eyes. Now, the eyes can be pretty tricky. The easiest way I've found to paint them is to hold the model on its side and then make a quick little dash with the brush just to cover the lens. I would encourage you take your time here, but in the event that that red ever spills over to somewhere where it shouldn't, don't sweat it. Quickly wash out your brush and then paint that water into the area. After it washes the paint off, go ahead and dry off your brush and then use it to soak up the water. Think of it like mopping up a floor. It's a good thing to be aware of that lighter colors, like your reds, oranges, and yellows, tend to have poor coverage. Don't be surprised if you have to apply a second layer of red to get that solid base coat. As it stands, our Marine looks more like a blue raspberry flavored energy drink as opposed to a terror troop of the 8th Legion. But this step is going to fix it up. We're going to apply Druchii Violet over the entire model. Now, while using washes, it's actually okay to glob these. Just make sure there's not any excess pooling in any of the areas. We actually want this to stain the whole armor and really unify all of the colors while sinking into the recesses and giving us some good definition. If any of the areas pool unnaturally, we want to clean those up so they don't become really dark and look bad and splotchy on the model. Just clean off your brush and apply it to the pooled up area, and your brush is going to drink up all of the excess paint there. While it might not look like it now, you've reached a major milestone. You've done all of the foundational skills of mini painting. From here on out, it's all about reinforcing them. Base coating, washing, highlighting, and simple freehands. So to finish up this squad, keep that brush steady and let's crack on to the last handful of details. For all the black details on the model, such as the bolter or the undersuit, we have the option to either base coat them with just any black paint, or we can wash over them with a black contrast paint. Now, my go-to bone recipe for skeletons and skulls is a base coat of Ivory, a wash with skeleton Horde, and highlighting the raised areas with the same Ivory base coat. For the lightning, you're going to want to get the tip of your brush as sharp as you possibly can and trace inside of those bolts we established before we applied the wash. If you want to be a little extra with this and add some real pop, take a bit of pure white paint and just dot the hot spots on the bolts, like the origin point and anywhere where it branches out. Metallics are as easy as they come. Base coat it with any paint that strikes your fancy and give it a black wash. Be aware, even if you clean up any areas you make a mistake with the metallic base coat, it could still leave some metal flakes, leaving your armor look a little glittery. For the bolters, a simple silver dry brush over that black looks too good for the amount of effort we put into it. Finally, to finish the base, I'm just going to apply some gray dry brushes to it. Keep in mind that if you chose to use a texture paint or a base ready mix, now would be the time to apply it. And with that, let's take a look at the finished squad. Well, Andy, congratulations. You're a mini painter now. Not only did you learn all of the foundational skills, like base coating, dry brushing, and washing, you also did some freehand, which can be a real intimidating hurdle for some people. Lastly, before I sign off, some of you may have noticed that there's only 9 models here. What about the Sergeant? Well, I've got some special plans for him in the future. And if you'd like to see it, I'd really appreciate a like on the video and subscribe. It really means a lot, and I'd like to see us hit 500 subscribers. And with any luck, it won't be a full month before I see you again. Until next time.